Have you ever wondered why the kindest people often end up carrying the heaviest scars? Why the people who care the most, give the most, sacrifice the most, somehow find themselves trapped in relationships that drain them, manipulate them, and leave them questioning their own worth? It's a pattern that repeats itself every day. The empathetic friend who always listens, but is never heard. The caring partner who gives everything, but receives the bare minimum. The compassionate soul who sees the good in everyone, even when everyone else sees the warning signs. And here's the shocking truth: empaths don't attract toxic people because they're weak. They attract toxic people because they possess something incredibly valuable: their kindness, their patience, their emotional intelligence, their ability to understand pain. To a healthy person, these qualities are a gift. To a toxic person, they're an opportunity. Because predators don't hunt the weakest target. They hunt the target that offers the greatest reward. And if you've ever found yourself wondering, why does this keep happening to me? Then today's message may change the way you see yourself forever. Because the answer isn't hidden in the toxic people you've met. The answer is hidden in the qualities that make you extraordinary. Today, we're going to uncover why empaths attract narcissists and toxic personalities, how these individuals identify their targets, and most importantly, how you can protect your greatest strengths without losing the compassion that makes you who you are. Because the goal is not to become colder. The goal is to become wiser. And once you understand the psychology behind this invisible dynamic, you'll never look at your relationships the same way again. Let's begin. There's something most people misunderstand about empaths. They assume that because empaths are compassionate, they are easy to fool. Because they are forgiving, they are unaware. Because they give second chances, they don't notice what's happening around them. Nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, empaths often see more than they say. They notice the hesitation before a promise is made. They hear the inconsistency in a story that doesn't quite add up. They feel the shift in someone's energy when words and actions no longer match. The difference is that instead of immediately confronting every issue, they choose understanding over reaction. They give people room to be human. They allow for mistakes. They recognize that everyone has bad days, moments of weakness, and decisions they wish they could take back. That's why many people are shocked when an empath finally walks away. From the outside, it appears sudden. One day they are present, supportive, patient, and invested. The next day they seem distant, detached, or completely gone. To the person who caused the damage, it feels like the empath disappeared without warning. But what they fail to realize is that the warning signs were there all along. The empath was simply hoping things would change. When trust is broken once, an empath often searches for context. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe there was stress involved. Maybe the person didn't fully understand the impact of their actions. Empaths naturally look beneath the surface because they understand that people are complex. They don't rush to judgment. They don't immediately assume malicious intent. They try to see the entire picture. But every broken promise leaves a mark. Every lie creates a crack. Every act of manipulation plants a seed of doubt. And while an empath may forgive the individual event, they rarely forget the pattern. That's the part people miss. Empaths are not keeping score in the traditional sense. They aren't sitting at home creating a list of grievances or waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Instead, they are quietly gathering information. Every interaction becomes data. Every disappointment becomes evidence. Every inconsistency adds another piece to a puzzle they never wanted to solve in the first place. At first, they focus on the good. They remind themselves of the person's strengths. They remember the moments of kindness. They hold onto the potential they see in the relationship. That's why toxic individuals often remain in an empath's life longer than they should. The empath isn't attached to who the person is today. They're attached to who they believe the person can become. And that belief is powerful. Sometimes it's so powerful that it causes them to ignore what is directly in front of them. They tell themselves this was the last time. They convince themselves the person learned from the mistake. They hope the apology means something. They invest more patience, more understanding, more emotional energy. But eventually, a moment arrives when the pattern becomes impossible to deny. The lie wasn't an exception. The betrayal wasn't an accident. The manipulation wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And once an empath reaches that realization, something shifts deep inside them. Not with anger, not with rage, not with a dramatic confrontation, with clarity. Clarity is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior because it eliminates confusion. The empath no longer spends energy trying to explain away what happened. They stop searching for alternative interpretations. They stop making excuses on behalf of someone who consistently chooses actions that create harm. For the first time, they see the situation exactly as it is. And that moment changes everything. Many people expect emotional people to react emotionally. They expect tears, arguments, emotional speeches, and endless attempts to repair the damage. What surprises them is that when an empath truly reaches their limit, the opposite often happens. They become calm, very calm. The constant questioning stops. The emotional investment begins to disappear. The need for explanations fades away. The empath realizes that some people don't need more chances. They need consequences. And the consequence is access. Access to the empath's time. Access to their attention. Access to their emotional support. Access to their presence. The person who repeatedly violated trust often assumes they can always come back. After all, the empath forgave before. They stayed before. They understood before. Why would this time be any different? Because this time isn't about forgiveness. It's about recognition. The empath finally recognizes that trust is not built through words. It is built through consistent behavior. They recognize that promises without action are simply noise. They recognize that respect cannot survive in an environment where deception is repeated over and over again. At that point, the relationship begins ending long before the physical separation occurs. The empath starts withdrawing emotionally. They stop sharing vulnerable parts of themselves. They stop seeking reassurance. They stop investing energy into fixing problems that only one person cares about solving. And perhaps the most dangerous part is that the person causing the damage often doesn't notice. They mistake silence for acceptance. They mistake patience for weakness. They mistake forgiveness for permission. Meanwhile, the empath is slowly accepting a difficult truth. You cannot build a healthy connection with someone who continuously destroys the foundation it stands on. Trust is that foundation. Without it, every conversation becomes uncertain. Every promise becomes questionable. Every moment of connection becomes fragile. And no amount of affection can compensate for that. Eventually, the empath reaches a point where staying hurts more than leaving. That is the moment people rarely see coming, not because it happens suddenly, but because they ignored the signs leading up to it. The empath has spent months, sometimes years, trying to preserve something that the other person repeatedly damaged. When they finally let go, there is often no grand announcement, no final warning, no dramatic exit, just distance, just silence, just absence. And for the first time, all of the energy that was once spent understanding someone else gets redirected inward, toward healing, toward peace, toward self-respect. The person left behind often wonders what happened. They replay conversations. They search for a specific moment that caused the departure. They look for a single event that explains everything. But the truth is far simpler. The empath didn't leave because of one betrayal. They left because repeated betrayals revealed a truth they could no longer ignore. A person who truly values trust protects it. A person who repeatedly breaks it eventually loses the privilege of having it. And when an empath finally understands that difference, they don't always fight. They don't always argue. They don't always seek revenge. Sometimes they simply walk away, carrying with them the one thing the other person never deserved to lose: their presence. One of the greatest misconceptions about empaths is that their ability to give is unlimited. People see their patience and assume it will never run out. They see their kindness and believe it will always be available. They see their willingness to help and begin treating it like a permanent resource rather than a precious gift. Over time, what started as appreciation quietly transforms into expectation, and expectation eventually becomes entitlement. The empath becomes the person everyone calls when life falls apart. They become the listener during emotional breakdowns, the voice of reason during conflict, the the source of comfort during uncertainty, and the safe place people run to when they need understanding. At first, they don't mind. In fact, helping others often gives them a sense of purpose. They genuinely care. They genuinely want to ease suffering. They genuinely want the people around them to succeed, heal, and grow. But what many people fail to understand is that even the strongest emotional support system requires support of its own. The empath may appear calm on the outside while carrying burdens nobody knows about. They may spend hours helping others process pain while silently struggling with their own challenges. They may offer encouragement while feeling exhausted. They may continue showing up for everyone else long after their own emotional reserves have started running low. The reason this goes unnoticed is because empaths rarely make their suffering the center of attention. They don't constantly announce their sacrifices. They don't keep reminding people how much they've done. They don't demand recognition every time they offer support. Instead, they continue giving because that is part of who they are. Unfortunately, this creates a dangerous dynamic. People begin taking without realizing how much they are taking. One conversation turns into 100 conversations. One favor becomes an expectation. One act of support becomes a permanent responsibility. Gradually, the relationship shifts into an imbalance where one person is consistently carrying the emotional weight while the other person simply receives. The strange thing about emotional exhaustion is that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens quietly. It builds in small moments that seem insignificant when viewed individually. A phone call where the empath listens for 2 hours but nobody asks how they're doing. A difficult day where they need support but find themselves supporting someone else instead. A moment of vulnerability that gets ignored because another person's problems always take priority. None of these experiences seem large enough to end a relationship. But together, they create something powerful. They create emotional depletion. Imagine carrying a backpack. One stone placed inside feels harmless. Another stone doesn't seem like a problem either. Then another. Then another. Eventually, the weight becomes overwhelming. The challenge is that nobody notices the burden because it accumulated gradually. The empath often doesn't even realize how heavy it has become until they can barely move forward. This is exactly how emotional exhaustion develops. Every unbalanced interaction adds another stone. Every act of taking without giving adds another stone. Every moment of feeling unseen adds another stone. And because empaths naturally focus on the needs of others, they often ignore the growing weight for far longer than most people would. They tell themselves they're strong enough. They tell themselves they're being selfish for feeling drained. They convince themselves things will improve. They continue showing up. They continue listening. They continue helping. But deep inside, something is changing. A quiet realization begins to form. The realization that they are constantly pouring energy into relationships that rarely pour energy back into them. This awareness doesn't arrive through a dramatic revelation. It emerges slowly through observation. The empath starts noticing patterns. They notice who only calls when they need something. They notice who disappears when support is needed in return. They notice who treats their compassion like a convenience rather than a gift. At first, they resist these observations because acknowledging them can be painful. Nobody wants to believe that people they care about have become dependent on their generosity without developing genuine reciprocity. Nobody wants to admit that some relationships survive primarily because of one person's effort. Yet reality has a way of making itself impossible to ignore. The empath begins noticing that every interaction leaves them feeling drained rather than connected. They notice that they leave conversations feeling heavier instead of lighter. They notice that their role has become predictable: problem solver, emotional caretaker, crisis manager, support system, but rarely friend. Rarely partner, rarely someone whose own needs matter equally. And this realization can be devastating because empaths invest deeply. They don't enter relationships halfway. When they care fully. They give attention, understanding, loyalty, patience, and emotional presence. Discovering that this investment is not being matched can feel like waking up from a long illusion. What's even more difficult is that many people genuinely don't realize what they're doing. They become accustomed to receiving support. They become comfortable with the empath always being available. Over time, they stop asking whether the empath has the capacity to carry another burden because they assume the answer will always be yes. That assumption is where relationships begin to break. Every human being has limits. Even the most compassionate person has limits. Even the most patient person has limits. Even the strongest heart has limits. The empath's limits simply tend to be farther away than most people's, which creates the illusion that they don't exist. But they do. And once those limits are reached, something unexpected happens. The empath stops fighting for the relationship, not out of anger, not out of hatred, out of survival. They recognize that continuing to give from an empty emotional reserve is no longer sustainable. They understand that constantly sacrificing their well-being for the comfort of others is slowly damaging them. For perhaps the first time, they begin asking a question they should have asked much earlier. Who is taking care of me? That question changes everything. Because once the empath starts evaluating relationships through that lens, the imbalance becomes impossible to miss. They see where effort flows in only one direction. They see where appreciation exists only when they are useful. They see where connection depends entirely on what they can provide. And when that awareness becomes clear enough, they begin reclaiming their energy. They answer fewer calls. They create more boundaries. They stop rescuing people from problems they refuse to solve themselves. They stop carrying responsibilities that never belonged to them. The people around them are often confused by this change. They interpret it as distance, coldness, or selfishness. They wonder why the empath seems different. What they fail to realize is that the empath isn't becoming less caring. They're becoming healthier. They're learning that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. They're learning that relationships should involve mutual investment. They're learning that constantly giving while receiving nothing in return isn't kindness. It's imbalance. And once that lesson is fully understood, the empath begins making decisions that once seemed impossible. They stop chasing. They stop overextending themselves. They stop proving their worth through sacrifice. Most importantly, they stop remaining in relationships where their value is measured only by what they can provide. The withdrawal often appears sudden to those who benefited from the empath's generosity. One day the support is there, and the next day it isn't. One day the empath is carrying everyone's emotional weight, and the next day they are nowhere to be found. But the truth is that this departure started long before anyone noticed. It began the moment the empath realized that giving and receiving had become hopelessly unbalanced. It began the moment they understood that their kindness had become a resource others consumed without replenishing. And it accelerated the moment they decided that their own well-being deserved the same care they had spent years giving to everyone else. By the time they finally step away, the decision has already been made deep within them. They are no longer running from people. They are returning to themselves. And once that journey begins, very few things are powerful enough to pull them back into the cycle they worked so hard to escape. There is a difference between being physically present in someone's life and truly seeing them. Most people assume that if they spend enough time with someone, they automatically understand them. They believe proximity creates connection. They believe conversations create understanding. They believe familiarity creates closeness. But for an empath, genuine connection goes much deeper than that. Empaths spend a significant portion of their lives paying attention to things other people overlook. They notice changes in tone. They recognize emotions hidden behind smiles. They detect discomfort before a word is spoken. They sense when someone is struggling even when that person insists everything is fine. Their attention naturally moves toward understanding the internal world of the people around them. Because of this, they often become experts at making others feel seen. They remember details. They remember fears. They remember dreams. They remember conversations that happened months ago. They remember the things people reveal when their guard is down. And perhaps most importantly, they remember how people feel. When someone is around an empath, they often experience a rare sense of being understood. They feel heard. They feel acknowledged. They feel valued. The empath creates an environment where people can be themselves without fear of judgment. The irony is that the people who make others feel understood are often the ones who feel the most misunderstood themselves, not because nobody listens, because very few people listen the way they do. An empath rarely seeks constant praise or attention. They don't need to be the center of every conversation. They don't require endless validation. What they desire is much simpler and much deeper. They want to know that their existence matters beyond what they provide. They want to know that someone notices them the way they notice everyone else. They want to know that their feelings are not an inconvenience. They want to know that their inner world is valued, not just their ability to support everyone else's. This need often goes unnoticed because empaths become so skilled at carrying emotional weight. People begin associating them with strength. They assume they don't require the same level of care. They assume they're always okay because they rarely complain. They assume they're emotionally self-sufficient because they seem capable of handling anything. But strength should never be confused with invulnerability. The strongest people still need connection. The strongest people still need understanding. The strongest people still need to feel valued. Over time, many empaths find themselves trapped in a painful pattern. They become the emotional caretaker in relationship after relationship. They listen, they encourage, they support, they give, they invest, they help others navigate challenges and overcome obstacles. Yet when they attempt to express their own emotions, the response is often different. Their concerns are minimized, their feelings are dismissed, their struggles are interrupted, their vulnerability is overlooked. At first, they don't make a big issue out of it. They tell themselves the other person is stressed. They tell themselves the timing isn't right. They tell themselves everyone gets distracted sometimes. And because they naturally prioritize harmony, they often let these moments pass without confrontation. But something important is happening beneath the surface. Every time their emotions are ignored, a small distance forms. Every time their efforts go unnoticed, a small distance forms. Every time they feel invisible within a relationship, a small distance forms. Individually, these moments seem insignificant. Together, they create emotional separation. The challenge is that most people don't recognize this process while it's happening. They assume the relationship is stable because there are no major arguments. They assume everything is fine because the empath continues showing up. They assume there is no problem because they haven't heard any complaints. What they fail to understand is that empaths often communicate through investment. When they care, they invest. When they feel connected, they invest. When they believe the relationship matters, they invest. The moment that investment begins to decrease, something significant is taking place internally. The empath is beginning to detach. Not because they want to, because they have to. There comes a point where constantly feeling unseen becomes emotionally exhausting. Imagine spending years learning someone's fears, preferences, insecurities, dreams, and emotional needs while feeling as though nobody has taken the time to learn yours. Imagine remembering every important detail about another person's life while realizing they consistently forget what's important to you. Imagine always being available for meaningful conversations while your own attempts at vulnerability are treated as secondary concerns. Eventually, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. The empath begins noticing patterns. They notice who remembers their needs and who doesn't. They notice who asks questions and who only talks about themselves. They notice who values their presence and who simply values their usefulness. This distinction is incredibly important. Many people appreciate what an empath does for them. Far fewer people appreciate who the empath actually is. An empath can sense the difference. They know when they are loved. They know when they are needed. And those two things are not always the same. Being needed feels good for a while. It creates a sense of purpose. It creates a role within the relationship. But eventually, the empath begins asking deeper questions. Would this person still value me if I stopped solving their problems? Would this person still seek me out if I had nothing to offer but my presence? Would this relationship survive if I stopped carrying the emotional load? The answers to those questions can be life-changing. Because once an empath realizes that their worth has become tied exclusively to what they provide, a profound shift begins. They start reclaiming parts of themselves they abandoned in order to maintain the relationship. They start protecting their energy. They start paying attention to how interactions make them feel. They start recognizing that constantly feeling invisible is not a normal part of a healthy connection. One of the most painful experiences for an empath is realizing that someone knows what they do but doesn't know who they are. The person knows they're supportive. The person knows they're reliable. The person knows they're compassionate. The person knows they'll be there during difficult times. Yet somehow, after years of connection, the person still doesn't truly see them, still doesn't understand them, still doesn't value the deeper parts of their identity. That realization often hurts more than open conflict. Conflict at least acknowledges existence. Being overlooked creates something far more damaging. It creates emotional loneliness. And emotional loneliness can exist even in the middle of a relationship. The empath begins feeling alone while sitting beside someone, unheard while speaking, unseen while giving everything they have. At a certain point, the pain of invisibility outweighs the comfort of familiarity. That's when the internal shift becomes irreversible. The empath stops seeking recognition from people unwilling to offer it. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop chasing understanding from those who have never made the effort to understand. Most importantly, they stop confusing proximity with connection. What follows is often surprising to everyone around them. The empath becomes quieter, more reserved, less emotionally available, not because their heart has hardened, because their awareness has sharpened. They realize that genuine connection cannot exist where mutual understanding is absent. They realize that relationships cannot thrive when only one person is doing the emotional work. They realize that constantly feeling unseen is not something to tolerate, it is something to learn from. The people around them often interpret this change incorrectly. They think the empath has become distant. They think the empath has changed. They think the empath is withdrawing for no reason. What they don't understand is that the withdrawal began long before the physical distance appeared. It started in every moment the empath felt invisible. It grew in every conversation where their feelings were ignored. It deepened in every interaction where their value was measured only by what they could give. And by the time the empath finally steps away, they are not acting on impulse. They are acting on accumulated truth, a truth that took months, years, and sometimes decades to fully accept. The truth that no matter how much love you give, no matter how much patience you offer, and no matter how deeply you care, you cannot build genuine connection with people who refuse to truly see you. And once that truth becomes clear, the empath doesn't always leave with anger. They don't always leave with resentment. Sometimes they leave with complete silence, because after spending so much of their life understanding everyone else, they finally understand themselves, and that understanding changes everything. So if there's one thing to remember from everything we've discussed today, it's this: an empath doesn't leave because they stop caring. They leave because they've cared for too long without being cared for in return. They don't disappear because of one mistake. They disappear after hundreds of moments that quietly taught them where they stand in someone's life. The ignored messages, the broken promises, the one-sided effort, the constant giving without receiving, the feeling of being valued only when they're useful, and perhaps the most painful realization of all, the feeling of being surrounded by people who know them, yet never truly see them. The truth is that empaths often stay longer than most people would. They fight for relationships longer. They forgive longer. They hope longer. They believe in people long after others would have walked away. But once they finally accept that their presence is being taken for granted, something changes forever. Because the same heart that gives endless chances is also capable of making one final decision. And when that decision is made, it rarely comes with drama. It rarely comes with revenge. It rarely comes with a final argument. It comes with silence. The kind of silence that appears when someone has exhausted every reason to stay. The kind of silence that follows complete clarity. The kind of silence that says, I finally understand what this relationship is and what it will never be. And that's why so many people don't realize what they've lost until it's already gone. Because they assumed the empath would always be there. They assumed the patience would never run out. They assumed the forgiveness had no limits. They assumed the door would always remain open. Until one day they turn around and discover that the person who gave them the most understanding, the most loyalty, and the most compassion is no longer standing there. Not because they stopped loving, but because they finally started loving themselves enough to leave. So let me leave you with a question. Think carefully about the people in your life who consistently show up for you. The people who listen when nobody else will. The people who support you when things fall apart. The people who offer kindness even when they receive very little in return. Do they know they're appreciated? Do they know they're valued? Do they know they're seen? Because sometimes the people with the biggest hearts are carrying the heaviest burdens in complete silence. And by the time they decide to walk away, they aren't looking for an apology. They aren't looking for another promise. They aren't looking for another explanation. They're simply looking for peace. And once they find it, they rarely look back. So the real question isn't why an empath disappears. The real question is, will you recognize their value while they're still there, or only after their silence becomes permanent? Think about that, and I'll see you in the next one.